All right, all right. Welcome. Welcome to the Church of Perpetual Life. So glad to have you all here. And I want to welcome everyone online who's live streaming today. You know, we've had as many as 60 people view our live streams, and I hope that we have a number of people out there in the world watching this. We are recording this, so this will be available for you to see again. And right after the event, it should be on our YouTube channel. And my name is Neil Vandry. I am your officiator here tonight. It's my pleasure to be here helping you to learn more about cryonics and unlimited lifespans. Here at the Church of Perpetual Life, we refer to ourselves as immortalists, not because we have yet found a way to defeat death, but we are working every day toward that end, toward an unlimited life. And it does appear that there are many ways that we're making inroads in science, finding ways to reverse the aging process and ultimately to defeat death. We've seen some amazing things happenings in laboratories all around the planet. Scientists reversing human aging in human cells and reporting on age reversals in lab rodents, as well as amazing work done by people like Dr. Church at Harvard University, who has stated that he will be able to reverse human aging in 5 years if he gets the funding for his projects. So we follow a couple of people here. We follow Arthur C. Clarke and Fedorov. Arthur C. Clarke said that the limits of the possible can only be defined by going beyond them into the impossible. Today it's currently pretty well accepted that you live, you age, and you die, and we're against that. We're against death. We're all for unlimited lifespans and living as long and as healthy as possible. So we are looking toward those treatments that will help us to do those things, those lifestyles that will help us to do that. And tonight we are celebrating Bedford Day. So we're going to have a presentation tonight on Bedford Day, and James Bedford was the first person in cryonic suspension. Dr. Bedford was suspended, I believe it was in California, and we'll hear more about that later. But a couple of things before we go forward. You may have noticed downstairs we now have t-shirts, logos both in black and in white. They're only $8. You're welcome to get one if you'd like. And see people wearing them all over the world. If you happen to wear them and you're someplace fun and interesting, text us a photograph. We'll get it on our Facebook page. So those are available. Also, we have cards that have been specially made up. And these are your invitation cards to be able to invite your friends and family to come here to Perpetual Life. So being here at the registration stand, you can get a couple of these and just put your name and your friends, your guests' name on the back. Invite them. You can tell them when our next event is. Our next event here at Perpetual Life will be later this month for our regular service, which will be January 24th, Thursday evening. Our doors will open at 6 o'clock, and the presentation will be at 7 p.m. with Steve Perry. Steve Perry will be here talking on GDF-11. And of course, after Steve Perry, we'll have an update on age reversal by Bill Falloon. Okay, before we get underway, we have a quick film. And this is a film from the library at Alcor, a prominent cryonics organization. So we'll go ahead and run that film, Doug. And here we go.
Some writers, reporters and journalists in particular, writing about cryonics, treat it as if it is some kind of alternative to burial or cremation, some exotic form of interment. That is completely wrong, completely misses the point of cryonics. Cryonics is simply an extension of critical care medicine. Medicine today has certain limits and capabilities. Let's go back about 50 years to get some perspective. Let's say you were walking down the street and somebody in front of you just suddenly fell over, and you went up to them and it stopped breathing. Back then, what would have happened is someone would have come and leaned over them, checked their breathing and their heartbeat, and they'd say, this person's dead. Today, in the same situation, medics are going to arrive on the scene, unless there's somebody already on the scene with some training, and they're going to immediately do things like CPR, defibrillation, administer calcium channel blocker drugs, and a variety of other things that in many cases will actually bring that person back to life. So we have to ask, 50 years ago, when someone leaned over the person and said, "She's dead," were they correct? Well, not in any final sense. So step forward to today. Today we do the same kind of thing. Doctors do a lot more these days. They can pull back people from a lot further down the path of deterioration, but still at some point they're going to say, "This person's dead," or "I declare this person clinically dead." What does that mean? It doesn't mean that all the cells in the body have died. It doesn't mean that the person has really gone away. It simply means they've stopped functioning to a point at which today's doctors of medicine, today's techniques and technologies can't do much for them. That doesn't mean they couldn't do something for them. In many cases, actually, they could revive the person, they could resuscitate them temporarily, but they don't do so because it would be pointless. They'd be miserable and they would die again a few minutes or a few hours later. So there isn't a sharp line here. Recoverability changes over time. So today's critical care medicine is much more advanced than that of 50 years ago. It's not unreasonable to think that the critical care medicine of 50 years or 100 years from now will be much more advanced than today's. That people who today apparently have succumbed to a fatal condition are actually retrievable. The problem is, how do we take someone with today's technology and get them to the future where more advanced technology exists that could revive them? And that is the rationale of cryonics. With today's medicine, if you have a severe medical problem in a place where it can't be treated, you're put in an ambulance, moved across space to another place where they have the technology and the tools to fix your problem. Cryonics does something sort of similar, except through time. We stop things getting worse by our various procedures, freezing you in place and take you into the future, one day at a time. So you can wait 50 years, 100 years, and you'll be in essentially the same condition as when you were first cryopreserved. But now, far more advanced technology will be available to treat the heart disease, the cancer, the infectious disease, the aging process, whatever it was that killed you. Killed you here being really only in that temporary sense, the sense in which you can potentially still be revived. So that's what cryonics is. That's how it relates to medicine. It's really an extension of critical care medicine. And how does it work? Well, the basic steps of a cryonics process, our way of doing critical care medicine when it's very critical, are like this. It starts off usually with a standby, which is just what it sounds like. We send out a team wherever you are, if we know you're critically ill, if you're terminal, and we stand by, we wait at your bedside. The next step is stabilization. When a person has been declared clinically dead, legally dead, which is what is necessary before we can begin our procedures, given the current laws, that's when the stabilization process begins. We immediately start external cooling of the patient, putting them in an ice bath, circulating icy water around them to drop body temperature as quickly as possible, towards but not below the freezing point. We administer a series of, at least at Alcor, 16 different medications which have a range of effects, including stabilizing membranes, neutralizing acidity, a whole range of effects, supporting blood pressure, heparin to keep the blood flowing. And at the same time, we undergo cardiopulmonary support. We restore circulation, we restore breathing, supported externally using various devices. So basically, within seconds of the person being declared clinically dead, we're restarting everything. We're getting things going again. So almost all the cells in the body are alive, it's just they don't know how to function together very effectively at that point. So we're immediately slowing down metabolism with this cooling, protecting the cells against various forms of damage with this chemical cocktail. Then we will transport the patient, which may involve, if they're in another state from where Alcor is based, here in Scottsdale, Arizona, may involve plane travel. If it's a more local case, we'll bring them on our emergency vehicle back to our main facility. And at that point, to simplify the process, we will remove the patient's blood. Let's say it's a local case where we haven't done a remote procedure, because there will be a remote operation in that case to remove the body fluids and the blood and replace them at that point with a transport solution. But in a local case, we'll bring them directly to Alcor, and then the goal is to remove as much fluid, as much water from the body as possible, because everybody knows water freezes, and freezing is not good for cells. It's going to damage the cell membranes. So replace as much of that fluid, intracellular fluid, blood, as possible with a cryoprotectant. You can think of a cryoprotectant simply as a medical grade antifreeze. And it's something that we've been working on for quite a few years, refining formulations to minimize toxicity while maximizing the protective effect on the cells. So over a period of several hours, we've replaced those fluids, and we can then at that point finally drop the patient below the freezing point of water and continue cooling as rapidly as we can. Those initial degrees are crucially important. Obviously, the warmer a biological system is, the faster metabolism is running, and when that metabolism is is deranged, when it's deteriorating, you want to slow that down as much as possible. So we'll drop temperature as fast as we can to around minus 110 degrees C, which is pretty chilly at that point. At that point, the body undergoes a phase transition. It starts turning into a true solid, and really all metabolic activity ceases. At that point, we slow down the cooling process to about 1 degree C per hour to avoid fracturing, which can happen in a large biological system as you cool at that temperature. And so it takes another couple of days before we reach the final temperature of minus 196 degrees C. That's minus 320 Fahrenheit. At that temperature, as I said earlier, you could wait for decades or a century, and you'll be in pretty much exactly the same condition as when you started. So that's the rationale. Cryonics really is an extension of critical care medicine. And I think doctors and nurses and other medical staff are beginning to understand that a lot better than they did in the past. I think the evidence for that is the cooperation we've seen with hospitals that's greatly improved since the earlier days. Quite often now, doctors, chief of staff will say, help these guys out if they want help, otherwise stay out of their way. They'll recognize what we're doing. They recognize some of the procedures from harvesting of organs. They've seen low temperatures used in surgery. Many parts of our procedures are actually very familiar to the medical profession. So cryonics is not some kind of exotic form of interment. It's simply an extension of critical care medicine. The idea is to give this person another chance with the more powerful technologies of the future. For more information, please visit www.alcor.org.
I like the phrase that Max uses. It's an extension of critical care medicine, an extension of what can be in the future. And so our event this evening will be centered around the idea of cryonics and Bedford Day, as our events are typically more focused on age reversal and healthy living and ways to reverse the aging process. Today it's going to be more centered on the cryonics and the process of cryonics. I'd like to point out a couple of things. We do have a couple of tables, one right out this room and one downstairs, where you can get more information on cryonics. If you'd like to look into that, there's information on those tables and you can do a little bit of research. Also is Esther here? Esther is right here, Esther. So we have the past president of the Holistic Chamber of Commerce with us. Esther is here tonight, and we're honored to have you. Thank you for coming this evening. And so as this is a special event, Bedford Day, those of you who are here for your first time, I welcome you and want to encourage you to come back to a regular service where we have one of our regular events. But at this point, I'd like to bring up our prime speaker for this evening, and that is, he is the past president and CEO of the Cryonics Institute, which is one of the world's largest cryonics organizations, and he was that for 9 years, between 2003 and 2012. Ben Best is a well-known activist in cryonics and life extension advocacy, and he holds undergraduate degrees in pharmacy from the University of British Columbia and physics and computing sciences and finance BBA from Simon Fraser University in British Columbia. Ben Best is also a certified professional registered parliamentarian by the National Association of Parliamentarians and is a distinguished member on our board. Let's welcome Mr. Ben Best. Come on up, Ben.
Okay, thank you. All right. Cryonics is part of life extension technology. You've heard a lot about Bill Falloon speaking many times about age reversal. And age reversal, if we can reverse aging, bring ourselves back to a youthful condition without dying, that's what we want to do. That's the first thing. That's plan A. Plan B is, if that fails, we want to preserve ourselves until the technology is available to bring us back to a youthful condition and cure whatever diseases we may be dying of. So cryonics is really part of the whole life extension enterprise. I want to emphasize that. And the first person who was cryonically preserved and is still under cryonic preservation was James Bedford, and that was this fellow here. He was preserved, that was 52 years ago, 1967, on the 12th of January, which is this coming Saturday, and we're celebrating that with this presentation today. And what I'm going to talk about is the difference, the way that the technology of cryonics has progressed between the time Bedford was preserved and what we have today. And I'm going to be just talking about mainly two organizations, the Alcor Life Extension Foundation and the Cryonics Institute, which are the two largest cryonics organizations in the United States. And both of those organizations have about now over 150 people in cryonic preservation, in liquid nitrogen, including James Bedford, who's being stored at Alcor. So he was a philosophy professor. He had a PhD. He wrote Robert Ettinger, the guy who created the whole idea of cryonics, or published it anyway. And he contacted him in June of '66. He was dying of liver cancer, which had spread to his lung. And at the age of 73, he was cryopreserved, 1967, January 12th, and he's still being stored in liquid nitrogen. And so a little bit more of a detail, he was in a nursing home, and his physician was summoned as he was deteriorating. They thought he was going to live another 2 weeks, but death doesn't happen on schedule. Happens by surprise sometimes, and that's what happened this time. And so his doctor arrived just before he died, and he was able to promptly pronounce, which is that was some very fortunate thing that happened, and a lucky accident. So he benefited a lot from it happening that way, more than many other people are able to experience now. Anyway, Dr. Abel and the hospice staff immediately dumped ice on Dr. Bedford and administered artificial respiration and chest compressions. And after 2 hours of cooling and compression, they summoned these other people to help further the process. Now, perfusion is where you put things in blood vessels, and so you use perfusion equipment to replace the blood that's in your blood vessels with an antifreeze solution. In this case, they intended to use 15% DMSO, and but they were expecting Dr. Bedford to die a couple weeks later, so the apparatus wasn't ready. They did the best they could. They just injected this solution into near his carotid arteries. Took the big needle and injected about 50 to 100 times into his arteries, and he did a lot of bleeding. There may have been some blood replacement with the antifreeze solution. And so then he was placed in dry ice for 6 days, and then in liquid nitrogen. They just put him in dry ice and then put him in liquid nitrogen, and would have been very shocking to the system to be just suddenly put in dry ice and also then suddenly put into liquid nitrogen. Dry ice is about minus 7 degrees Celsius, and liquid nitrogen is minus 196 degrees Celsius. Anyway, he was maintained in liquid nitrogen by his family until being transferred to Alcor Life Extension Foundation in 1982, where he's remained ever since. And his body was examined in 1991. It showed no indication that he'd been warm. So he's actually been at cryogenic temperatures since 1967, which is quite a feat, 52 years. So now I want to talk about ischemia. Now, what's that about? That we don't have, in cryonics, we don't have this concept of death, life and death. It's not like this binary thing, either you're alive or you're dead. Legally, that's true, but biologically, it's not true. Biologically, what happens is your heart stops, and then there's a very slow, tissues degrade rapidly here. Actually, tissues degrade fairly slowly. It depends on what you're talking about. The brain tissues degrade somewhat, but actually it's after 6 hours, your cells are usually still functioning to some extent. But the more you cool, the more you can prevent this degradation. So ischemia is what we're focused on, this process of there being no blood flow. And if there's no blood flow, the cells don't get any oxygen or nutrient, and there's no waste waste removal from the cells and tissues. And we talk about warm ischemia, and this is if this is what happens if warm ischemia is what happens if somebody just drops dead and just lies there on the floor or in a hospital bed or something, and that's it. The heart's not running, and so there's not getting blood to supply the body, and just this decomposition process starts. Whether it's rapidly or slowly is anyway. It's more slow if the patient is at a lower temperature, at ice temperature, much slower. So we talk about warm ischemia and cold ischemia. We talk about CPR and CPS to contrast cryonics from, because we know when the heart stops, even in conventional medicine, that doesn't mean the end of the story. If the heart stops, you can sometimes administer CPR, cardiopulmonary resuscitation, give ventilation and chest compressions, and maybe the heart will start again, and the person will not be dead. So that's CPR. In cryonics, we talk about cardiopulmonary support. We're not really talking about bringing the person back to life, but we are talking about getting the blood circulating and getting a ventilation and so forth in order to keep the cells alive. So even though the person is legally dead, we're still keeping the cells and tissues alive. And but we only do really CPS if there has been a legal declaration of death, because that gives us permission to go ahead with the cryonics procedures. We cannot do this to a person who's legally still alive. But we, as I say, it's a legal distinction. It's not that they're really dead in some ultimate sense from our point of view. So these are two pieces of equipment for the cardiopulmonary support. This here is a bag valve. You put this on the person's face and you pump air into their lungs, and you do chest compressions with this device. Now this is a special device that isn't normally used in medicine. Not only see this suction cup here attaches to the chest, and so we're able to get a better heart massage, cardiopulmonary support, artificial heart action with this device than you get with just conventional CPR, because in this case, because this suction device applies to the chest, you're able to have an upstroke to pull up the chest as well as a downstroke. The FDA doesn't approve this device for living people, but we can use it in cryonics. So this shows a person giving cardiopulmonary support. This person is obviously they're mimicking the process. But anyway, this is what we would be doing. Applying the bag valve and giving ventilation and doing this up and down chest compression to get the blood circulating. So besides the CPS, we also use an ice bath because it slows metabolism, reducing ischemic damage. The slower the metabolism, the less the ischemic damage. So with the CPS, we're maintaining the blood flow and providing the artificial respiration, and the ice bath and cooling plus the CPS. All these are intended to keep the cells and tissues alive in a legally dead person. And so this is an example of the person being in an ice bath. This would be filled with water and ice, and we've got this suction cup device, and this is done mechanically, not manually. And the mechanical system doesn't get tired because this thing can just keep running and applying the chest compressions and also applying the ventilations. So we want to have a standby team, as was mentioned in the previous video, and this is a group of people who will stand by the bedside of a cryonics patient, somebody in a hospital who's near death, and once they are declared dead, we want this standby team to immediately go into action and apply the CPS and the cooling and so forth. So the standby teams that we have now are Suspend Animation, and they provide this service for a fee to Alcor and Cryonics Institute members here in the United States. And there's also international cryomedical experts that provides the service outside of the United States. And but of course there needs to be pronunciation of death, so it helps to have a physician or nurse available to pronounce death before the standby team can swing into action. And but who can pronounce death differs by legal jurisdiction and circumstance. Sometimes a nurse or paramedic can pronounce death. Sometimes only a physician. It varies from state to state, and under various circumstances. And it can be and also sometimes a nurse can only pronounce death if the patient is known to be terminal, known to have 6 months left to live, and not authorized to do so otherwise. So it varies a lot from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And so if there doesn't happen to be somebody around who can pronounce death, then the standby team just sort of has to wait there, and they can't do anything. So they have to try to get a hold of somebody to pronounce death before they can do anything. And so there's also the possibility of physician-assisted suicide. Now, if there's physician-assisted suicide, one thing's for sure: there's going to be the physician who's administering the toxic substance that results in suicide is going to be there. So this issue of having a person around to pronounce death will not be a problem. And so far, there's only a few states that allow physician-assisted suicide, and the whole left coast here, the California, Oregon, and Washington, as well as Colorado, and also Vermont up there, and also Hawaii will allow physician-assisted suicide. So anyway, there are many people in cryonics who are hoping that this will become more prevalent, and that this will allow terminal people who are close to death to not worry about whether there's going to be a physician around to pronounce death. Another alternative is some people just refuse to eat and drink any fluids, and so they go into a slow death by that means, and that's another way of dealing with the problem. So we know that cooling reduces tissue degradation. We know we use refrigerators and freezers to preserve food with low temperature, and the lower the temperature, the less the degradation of the temperature that's going to occur. So that's why I spoke so much about cooling. At extremely low temperatures, molecular motion is effectively stopped, and tissues can be preserved for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, even hundreds of thousands. If the temperature is low enough, we're talking about liquid nitrogen temperature here, or at least cryogenic temperatures. Temperatures below 100 degrees Celsius, or 100 or 200 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's the faster you can cool, the better, and the faster you cool a patient, the less ischemic damage will occur to the tissues. So you can just pile ice bags on the patient, and that'll cool a bit. But you can cool faster by putting them in an ice bath, because the cold water it has a better conductivity. It exchanges heat better, and even better than that is if you circulate the cold water, and it's faster than just a simple ice bath. So this is a squid. This is what they call a squid. These arms here, it makes it look like a squid, and then they'll have a pump here to circulate the water very rapidly and accelerate the cooling process. So anyway, this is an example of different cooling methods on different patients. So 240 minutes is like 4 hours. So in this case, just putting ice bags on a patient got the temperature down from body temperature down only to about body temperature dropped only really about 15 degrees over a course of 4 hours, which is not fast enough really, or not. It's too slow. Much slower anyway than using an ice bath. So in this case, the ice bath, we got a cooling after say after 2 hours, we got down to just about the final temperature with the ice bath. We got down to the final temperature after 2 hours. That took you 4 hours with the ice bags, and then by having the squid and the circulation after 2 hours, we got even much colder here. This is down to 10 degrees Celsius. So we were considerably cooler after after cooling with the squid. Ultimately, after the 4 hours, both these processes ended up the same temperature. So anyway, that's showing. That's another picture of somebody in an ice bath, or a dummy in an ice bath, and getting cardiopulmonary support. And this is yet another picture, except in this case, it's showing the administration of meds. So not only is the patient getting in ice, getting cooled, and getting this thumper applying artificial heart circulation, but we've got these meds going in of various kinds. So what kind of meds are we administering? Well, these days we use heparin and sodium citrate, and these prevent blood clotting. And streptokinase actually dissolves blood clots. Epinephrine and vasopressin, these maintain blood pressure. Because even though the patient's dead, you can contract their blood vessels and maintain the blood pressure, and that improves perfusion of the blood into the tissues. And Maalox, stomach acidity can be a serious problem after a person's legally dead, and Maalox helps prevent that problem. Propofol will reduce brain metabolism, and the more you reduce brain metabolism both by cooling and chemically, the less ischemic damage is going to happen. And mannitol will inhibit tissue cell swelling, and dextran 40, this will prevent tissue edema. This has to do with getting into the cells, and this has to do with getting across the blood vessels. So it would be faster, instead of putting a person in an ice bath, even with a squid, to actually put a cold fluid directly into their blood vessels, and this is indeed done once the person is cooled to a certain degree. Eventually, this eventually does happen, and the cold fluid that's put in is generally a organ preservation solution. But if you can get this cold fluid in, getting a cold fluid through the blood vessels is going to cool much faster than external cooling. But the problem is, it requires surgery. You have to find the blood vessels and insert these cannulas and so forth. And this surgery can take anywhere from 15 to 45 minutes, depending on the skill of the surgeon and the condition of the patient and so forth. So, and it's hard to do in an ice bath, and with doing CPS. So basically, you're letting a lot of warm ischemia happen before you can actually do this process. So in a way, it's defeating the purpose, having to wait for surgery, if surgery is going to take a long time. So there's another process, liquid ventilation. So this only shows cooling about 6 degrees, but it's comparing. Liquid ventilation is where you put a liquid right into the lungs, and you're also you've got cardiopulmonary support going, and so the lungs are this cold fluid in the lungs. Cold fluid is cooling the blood, and therefore in a way you're getting internal cooling, and this shows what you get with an ice bath, very much slower cooling, where as opposed to this liquid ventilation process, very, very fast cooling. 10 minutes you get drop down 6 degrees here. But this is this is actual data. This is theoretical data. Problem is that liquid ventilation is not yet a perfected technology, but it's being worked on quite a bit, and hopefully it will be in practice within the next year. Anyway, there's also problems if now if a patient is located close to a cryonics facility, then that simplifies the process because you can just take the patient directly into the cryonics facility and treat them. But if they're not local to the cryonics facility, the standby team has to wash the blood out and ship the patient in ice. So, as I say, the blood is washed out. You want to wash the blood out before you ship them in ice. Viaspan is the most widely used substance for preserving organs. When you transplant organs, you want to make sure the organ is fresh and viable, and it's the same with the cryonics patient. So you use some organ preservation solution to wash the blood out and ship them to the cryonics facility. And this is a Ziegler shipping cases. These are packed with ice, and the patient is put in here, and that's how the patient gets shipped, say, from Florida to Arizona if it's Alcor, or Michigan if it's the Cryonics Institute. So what about ice? Well, that's fine. You don't go down to cryogenic temperatures and get a lot of ice. Ice is very damaging when it freezes, and the body has a lot of ice in it. And as I mentioned here, ice is, unlike a lot of other substances, when the water turns to ice, it expands, and that's very, very damaging. And this is what ice looks like. It forms these little lattices, and these are all water molecules. Each of these, the black dots are hydrogen, and the white dots are oxygen. As you know, water is H2O, so all these H2Os are all linked together, and that's what ice looks like. So we don't want ice really. So we try to get a process called vitrification, which is, say, making a glass and not a crystal. Ice is a crystal, but you know that the glass we have in our window panes and our drinking, our drinking glasses are made of silicon dioxide plus soda and lime, and that makes it turn into a glass and not a crystal. Glass is not a crystal; they're different. If you ever saw a glass blower working, you have a very the glass is initially very fluid, and the glass blower will cool and shape the glass more and more until it's not crystalline, but it's still solid, and there's a slow transition. The viscosity of the thickness of the glass gets to be greater and greater until it gets to be like a solid, but it doesn't form a crystal. And so that's what we want to do we want to have, instead of having ice forming, instead of water forming ice, we want to have some solution that will solidify in the same way. Instead of forming this crystal that's so damaging, we want to have it form a glass. And so there are actually chemicals that you can use to cause this vitrification, to cause, instead of water, you can mix it with water, and it will prevent water from forming ice. And these are different chemicals, and one thing you'll see in common with these chemicals down here is that they have these OH groups. I said, remember, water is H2O, and so this is not quite H2O, it's got two OHs, but these OHs interact with the OHs and H2O. and they prevent the OHs from that normally want to form ice from forming ice. And so you have these solutions here, and glycerol is the one that has been historically was the very first cryoprotectant discovered, really, and it's actually still used. Was used to preserve red blood cells and sperm for cattle. They're able to still glycerol is still used to preserve blood for transplant. Because you don't want if you're going to be a transfusion, if you're going to be using a blood for transfusion, you don't want degrading. So you want to keep it at a low temperature, just like we want to do in cryonics. The same idea. You don't want to prevent the ischemic damage, and so you mix it with glycerol and you keep it at a low temperature, and then you warm it up and transfuse it into a patient. And DMSO, it looks a little bit different, but this it's also used for the same purpose. It just doesn't have OH groups, but this oxygen here serves the same function. Enough of that. So anyway, actually vitrification, there have been quite a few achievements here. That with a rabbit brain has been vitrified. It showed no ice anywhere. Electron micrographs showed no sign of ice. And hippocampal brain, hippocampus is part of the brain, actually the most sensitive, the part of the brain that helps us form short-term memories, like remembering telephone numbers or whatever. And anyway, these slices were cooled to minus 130 degrees Celsius and rewarmed, and they showed 100% viability. And rabbit kidney, this was probably the most famous example. It was vitrified. It was cooled to minus 135 degrees Celsius and rewarmed and transplanted back into a rabbit, and able to sustain the rabbit as a sole functioning kidney. So vitrification has a lot of possibilities here. And we use it in cryonics. As I mentioned, right after the year 2000, all the cryonics patients they only use glycerol. But glycerol is very viscous. It's not a very good vitrification solution. So the best you can say glycerol did was it reduced ice formation. But it didn't actually vitrify. You just get less ice, not no ice. Vitrification is you get no ice, and that's what we want to get. So Alcor began perfusing patients with solutions intended to vitrify, and they finally settled on the best vitrification solution known to date, M22, and that was in October 2005. And the Cryonics Institute, they began perfusing their patients with what they called Vitrification Solution 1, VM1, in August 2005. So after you've vitrified, you need to cool the patient. After you've make sure there's no ice formation, after you've got the vitrification solution in the patient, now you start cooling. And you want to cool down the liquid nitrogen temperature. So this is an example of the cooling box that they have at the Cryonics Institute, there's the cooling box has this spray bar, and the nitrogen gas is the liquid nitrogen is sprayed into this box, and there's little holes all along the spray bar, and actually the cooling it isn't like you're just spraying liquid nitrogen onto the patient. Actually, the cooling process happens because there's a phase transition. When it turns to when the liquid turns to gas, a lot of heat is absorbed in that process, and that's actually what causes the cooling process. You're not just spraying liquid nitrogen on the patient. It's the evaporation that's really cooling. Just like if you're out in a hot day and you've got all this liquid, all this sweat all over you, and you blow yourself with a fan or something, the the water will evaporate. And the water cools you. And going from a liquid state to a gas state is what cools you when your sweat evaporates. And it's the same process here. So this shows the cooling process. We want to cool, and this blue line shows the body temperature. That's measuring the body, and the green line is measuring the head, and the red line is just the temperature of the cooling box itself inside the cooling box. And as you can see, in the first 23 hours, the body the body has a lot of mass, so it takes a long time to cool, whereas the head doesn't have so much mass, and the head cools much more quickly. And that's really what you want, especially because the head is where the brain is, and you especially want to reduce any ischemic damage in the brain as much as possible. So you're cooling as quickly as possible, and that's but this is up to what we call the solidification temperature, last transition temperature. So all the way down to just below 120 degrees Celsius, the vitrification solution is still liquid. It doesn't turn into a solid until you get to this way down here, minus 120 degrees Celsius. And so once you've got a solid, once the vitrification solution inside the human body has turned into a solid, then you want to stop cooling as fast as possible. Now you want to cool very slowly. And the reason for that is to avoid cracking. And let's see if I'm getting to that. Well, it's first just as far as the story is concerned. This is some of the oldest of Cryonics Institute equipment. This unit here is still holding human patients. This holds seven human patients in here in liquid nitrogen, and that is costing $274 a year to maintain in liquid nitrogen. That's the cost of liquid nitrogen per year to maintain them in this box. The newer boxes, the newer cryostats they call them, the cost is only $100 per patient per year, and that's partly because of this design. It's a much better design, but another reason is because they have a 3,000-gallon bulk tank, and they're able to get by buying in a large quantity. They're able to this is behind their building. They're able to save on the cost of liquid nitrogen and keep it down to, say, $100 per year for most of their patients. Now, I mentioned the cracking problem. So once there's a solidification happening, which happens, as I say, just below 120 degrees Celsius with either the Alcor's solution or the Cryonics Institute solution. Once the solidification happens, then with a solid, if you're cooling from the outside in, which you have to do in a cooling box, the outside is getting the cold liquid nitrogen, the coldness, and it's contracting more than the inside. So that results in thermal stress. When you've got an outside, you can't cool the whole thing uniformly. You have to cool from the outside in. The outside is getting cooled more. The more you cool something, the more it contracts. You got the outside cooling more than the inside, contracting more than the inside, and the result is cracking. And so the problem is that all the cooling. So we cool as slowly as we can from minus 124 to minus 196, but we're always causing cracking and fracturing. The idea of cooling slowly is to minimize the cracking and fracturing, but we never eliminate it. We can't eliminate it in that temperature range. But I mean, if a sample was small enough, you could avoid cracking. But a human body is not small enough. Dr. Brian Wolk has cooled a vitrified rabbit kidney, which has a volume of about 10 milliliters, which is equivalent to about 2 teaspoonfuls, and he was able to cool with no down to liquid nitrogen temperature with no fracturing or cracking. He cooled very slowly. Took him 2 days to get down there, but he avoided the cracking. But 2 teaspoonfuls of that kind of volume is you can't do that with a human cryonics patient or even a human brain. But so one idea is how about not going down to liquid nitrogen temperature? Why not store it at an intermediate temperature between that's less than liquid nitrogen temperature, but still very, very cold? And so that's called intermediate temperature storage. And that's intended to minimize or even eliminate cracking. And so as I mentioned, the solidification temperature, it solidifies at minus 124. But Alcor now has the intermediate temperature storage is something between minus 135 and minus 145, and at that temperature you can avoid isonucleation. I'm not going to describe that process, but that's another problem, and also minimize or eliminate cracking. And actually, we know now that Alcor has several patients that are being held at this temperature. They have special units, but it's only heads. They can't do whole bodies. So it's only people who heads and brains who are being stored that way. They can be held at this temperature. The technology has not been perfected for whole bodies, but for many people, preserving the head is the most important part because that's where your brain is, and also they believe future technology will be able to create a new body anyway. So that's why many patients are neuro patients, and these neuro patients are able to benefit from this intermediate temperature storage. Speaking for myself, I have a special arrangement where, anyway, maybe I shouldn't say that. Anyway, there was one person, Stephen Coles. He didn't have enough money for cryonics, but he volunteered to be an experimental subject. So they gave him the cryonics at no cost to him. They gave him they vitrified him. They took his brain out and stored it at minus 145 degrees Celsius, and there was no cracking. So this was a big breakthrough, just because they never really had a human subject to do this before, and so if you don't have any money and you still want cryonics for yourself, you can ask Alcor to volunteer to be an experimental subject, and they will preserve you and do some experiment like this. But you'll still get the benefit of cryonic preservation at no cost to yourself, and also contributing to the advancement of cryonics technology, as happened with the case of Stephen Coles. Now, I guess we've got another problem, and that is sudden death, and that we're trying to deal with. It's nice to have a standby team on hand, but what happens if your heart stops and there's no standby team? And that can happen easily, too easily. Many, unfortunately, Cryonics members are elderly and they live alone at home, and their heart could stop at any time, and we would like to have some sort of alarm system. As I say, a chain is only strong as the weakest link, and less than half of cryonicists who've arranged for standby have actually received standby. Most of those who get standby are those dying of cancer, because cancer is a slow death, but heart attack often is not a slow death. So between the ages of 20 for males, and males are more vulnerable under the age of menopause, males are much more vulnerable to sudden death and heart attack than females are. So about a third of all deaths in males in this age range are due to sudden cardiac death, and a quarter of those showed no prior sign of heart disease whatsoever. So, and then males aged a little bit older, 60% of the sudden cardiac deaths had no indication of heart disease. It takes women have the same sort of statistics, but only after menopause, because estrogen is very protective of the heart, and so women are. But once they get past menopause, they're in the same situation as males. Anyway, some elderly cryonicists have just lain on the floor, and all they would have had to, they just drop on the floor, and they lie there and die. If they had at least a panic button system, they could alert people to come, or 911, and the 911. If they're dying, or even if they have died, if they push this panic button, 911 came. They could give chest compressions and ventilations while driving the hospital. The emergency personnel, if they can't pronounce death, they see you lying on the floor. You have no heartbeat. They have to give you chest compressions driving to the hospital, because they're not able to pronounce, and they can't say conclusively that you're dead. So even if you are legally dead, even if your heart isn't going to stop, this is going to help you. You're getting these chest compressions and ventilations, and it's keeping your tissues alive. So if your cryonics team can rush to the hospital and get a declaration of death, then they can start their procedures. So there are just too many cases like this. I don't know, Cryonics Institute patient Hugh Hart. I know he died on a Friday, but he wasn't discovered until Monday. So he spent the whole weekend with this warm ischemia, basically decomposing. An Alcor, this is an Alcor patient. He was dead for a whole week in his apartment. And this guy, FM 2030, he thought he was going to live till 2030. He was, very advanced transhumanist, and really dedicated to life extension and all these other things. But he lived alone, and this is what happened to him. And it's happened too many times. So, and even if you're not living alone, I know there was a case of, you could die in your sleep, and your spouse wakes up and finds you dead in the same bed. I know a CI member who just dropped dead in one room of a house, and his wife was in another room and didn't come into that room for hours later, and so she had no notification whatsoever. So as far as panic button systems, we've got this. I think this MobileHelp medical alert system is pretty good, and basically the base station has a 1,000-foot range, 3 football fields, and a mobile unit has a 600-foot range, and the mobile unit. Let's see, the mobile unit. This is the mobile unit. That's the mobile unit. This is the base station. The mobile unit, you can take that with you. You could go thousands of miles away and still use the mobile unit, and it'll contact your call center, but you have to. Anyway, it'll detect if you fall, and it also has GPS, so you could be thousands of miles away from your home and have that mobile unit. If you fall down, and you don't move, the GPS it'll send an alarm, and emergency personnel can come and help you. This is electronic caregiver is another system. This is actually has motion detection, and so you can set this. It has a 24/7 call center, and It also has a large range. This is especially good for people living at home, but if you can go away from home and carry your cell phone if it detects inactivity for, I don't know, half an hour or so, and you're supposed to be home, then the emergency personnel will be notified. I think the best thing we've got really for so far, I've been watching these vital sign monitors for a long time and trying to find a good alert system. I think the best thing on the market now is the Apple Watch Series 4, and it has an emergency SOS feature, which is like a panic button feature, which you can press, and it'll call 911. And 911 will get your location. It has a GPS feature, and it also notifies, besides calling 911, it notifies people in your contact list. And it can also notify the user if the heartbeat falls below 10 beats per minute for more than 10 minutes. So you get notified. It doesn't, 911 or your contacts don't get notified, but at least if you know your heartbeat is dropping, you can activate this SOS if you think you're gonna die or something, and it's FDA approved, which I think is a big bonus. And I think I also use this in combination. A key guard lockbox. You put this on your door, and put your keys in there so that if you die in your house or your apartment, an emergency personnel don't need to break the door down to get in. So that helps speed things up, and you can give the combination of your lockbox to the call center. So anyway, really what we were looking for is something that like you can wear in a watch-like device that rapidly detects loss of vital signs, that would send messages by phone number and email and so forth, and including a call center that has GPS to know your location, that has low power consumption, so the batteries don't burn out after just a few hours. It'll last at least 24 hours. Convenient to recharge, and wirelessly operate anywhere, and the false alarms are minimal and easily handled. So this is technology that's coming. There's a lot of other technologies. I mentioned also. How far I can go back here? I mentioned also that liquid ventilation has not been. I showed that liquid ventilation. Oops. What am I going in the wrong direction here? Oh, okay. So I said liquid ventilation has not been perfected yet. I said we were hoping that it'll be perfected within the next year, and to get this much more rapid cooling, this kind of effect. And we don't want to just cool a few degrees. We want to cool all the way down to 20 degrees Celsius very rapidly. We could do that within a half hour. That would be great, instead of all this many hours that I showed. Happens with the other methods. Yeah, much faster than this. So that's a technology that's in the process of being developed, and hopefully within next year we'll have that. And Alcor Life Extension Foundation received a $5 million grant earlier this year by some guy who made a lot of money on cryptocurrency, and and this grant is specifically developed for research. So Alcor is spending at least $100,000 on developing this liquid ventilation system with this. A larger expense is Alcor is also spending money on a CT scanner, so they can monitor the cryoprotectant going in real time, and improve if there's a problem, if the cryoprotection isn't going in at a proper rate and so forth, they can monitor it and improve the perfusion capability. And they're also spending the money on. They also want to spend money on looking at all the cryonics patients that have already been perfused and preserved, and evaluate how well they have been vitrified using this CT scanner to try to improve their methods, to make sure they're improving their methods. Now, there's a lot of other improvements, cryonics technology improvements that we'd like to see happen. Of course, part of that is just a rejuvenation and reanimation process, as I mentioned. We don't want to be, even if cryonics works and you're able to bring people back, you don't want them to come back in a state of disease condition or even elderly condition. You want to bring them back in a youthful condition. So that's certainly a technology that needs to be perfected. But also, we want to improve the vitrification solutions we're using, because there's a certain toxicity to the vitrification solutions we're using. And if we could have less toxic vitrification solutions, we could avoid a lot of the problems with rewarming and even intermediate temperature storage. We could probably cool to a lot lower temperatures than the intermediate temperature storage, perhaps even down to liquid nitrogen temperature. And there's a lot of technologies we want to see improved. Obviously, we're not at the point where we'd like to be able to reversibly perfuse. In other words, put a vitrification solution into a person, cool them down, and then warm them right back up, or a person or an animal. And say somebody was on a battlefield or something and they got injured. If you could vitrify them and cool them and ship them to a hospital somewhere, and then warm them back up again and fix them. So that kind of technology would be hugely beneficial for cryonics, and it was also proof to the world that cryonics can actually work. You wouldn't be, as it is, we're relying a lot on future technology here rather than present technology. And some people don't think cryonics will ever work, and certainly if we had that, if cryonics was perfected to that extent, everyone would know that it does work. And not only that, it would be a great boon to immediate medicine, because you could just cryopreserve people and in a battlefield or anywhere else, and take them to where they need to be, and warm them back up again, and have them be in good condition. But right now, cryonics is medical time travel. We're waiting. We're preserving people and hoping that future medicine will be able to bring them back and repair all the problems and rejuvenate them. Thank you.
Okay,
Any
Ben
questions?
Best. Ben, we have about 5 minutes for Q&A. If there's any questions for Ben on cryonics and his presentation, yes. Okay, Kathy.
Ben, I've read about a dog that was revived after being frozen for about, I think it was 5 hours. But what proof is there that anything happens with cryonics at all, such as preserving of the brain and personality?
Well, I mean, as far as these dogs, they were cooled down to, they weren't cooled below really much. If they're cooled to zero, you know, with cryonics, we're talking about cryogenic temperatures. We're talking about temperatures much less than freezing temperature, way, minus, liquid nitrogen temperature is minus 320 degrees Fahrenheit. And these dogs were cooled to only 32 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a big difference as far as but their mental function was intact. They were able to. The dogs were brought back. They needed a bit of recuperation time, but we'd like to be able to cool down to cryogenic temperatures and see that kind of recovery. But there was no brain injury for these dogs for which this procedure worked.
There's a question from Suji.
It's my metaphysical question. Hi. When Mr. Bedford finally, let's say they've come up with everything to heal his body, whatever took him, who comes back in that body? Is it going to be his memories, his personality, his quirks, his fears, his loves? I mean, who's waking up in that body?
I believe if the brain is perfectly preserved, I believe he would come back, but and perfectly preserved and enough to be reconstructed to be exactly the same kind of brain. In my point of view, I mentioned kidney preservation. A kidney produces urine, and the brain produces consciousness. And I believe if injuries to the brain result in mental function, mental problems, and any neurologist will tell you, damage this part of the brain and you'll get this problem. Damage that part of the brain, you'll get that problem. And so if we can minimize or even eliminate any damage to the brain in the cryopreservation process and bring the brain back as it was originally, you should have the original person.
Okay, Ben Best, thank you. Thank you very much. I'll stay with this. So thank you very much, Ben, and I want to remind you that we're going to have another presentation this month on January 24th when we have Steve Perry come, and he'll be discussing GDF-11. After that, Bill Falloon will give his monthly update on age reversal. And let's see. I want to remind you that we have a Cryonics table if you want more information on Cryonics right outside this room, and downstairs also. We have the library open if you'd like to check out a book. And I want to thank all of you who brought food tonight for our potluck. I appreciate that. And we're going to, yes, and we have time now to meet and talk to each other and to socialize downstairs and enjoy some more of the food. So let's do that and adjourn at this point, and thank you for coming. Oh, you know what? There's one more thing. We have a film, don't we? We have one more, it's like a 4-minute film. It's a film from Cryonics Institute. Let's go ahead and show that film quick, and then we'll adjourn after that. Go ahead, Doug. Thank you.
The fascinating science of cryonics could give people a second chance at life. The whole idea of cryonics started with physics professor Robert Ettinger. He pioneered the movement with his seminal book, The Prospect for Immortality. He then went on to launch the Cryonics Institute. But just what is cryonics, and what does the Cryonics Institute do? Cryonics is a procedure that preserves the human body at low temperatures after death, in the hope it can be revived in the future. The process should begin immediately after a person is declared legally dead. Even though the heart has stopped beating, there's still brain function during this period. So a heart-lung resuscitator is used to stabilize the body and keep the brain supplied with blood and oxygen. The body is cooled in an ice bath to slow down metabolic demand and to protect both DNA and organ structure. Then anticoagulants and protective medications are injected into the body to stop the blood clotting during transit. The body is then packed in ice and transported to a cryonics facility. Once there, a process called vitrification begins, where the blood is replaced with a cryoprotectant antifreeze solution. This is done to prevent the cells from freezing and to stop ice crystals from forming around organs at extremely low temperatures. The body is then placed in a computerized vapor cooling chamber and cooled to negative 196 degrees Celsius. Once the body is properly cooled, the patient is transferred to a long-term cryostat storage container. Thousands of people are signed up for cryonics throughout the world, and the numbers are steadily growing. The Cryonics Institute is the world's largest provider of whole-body cryonics. They have performed more whole-body human and pet cryosuspensions than any other organization. The Cryonics Institute is also the most affordable cryonics company, with a whole-body suspension fee of only $28,000. Most people can afford this cost with simple life insurance. Our organization is a member-owned nonprofit with open financial records. Suspension money collected is carefully invested in secure endowment-like securities. The investment dividends earned from these investments fund perpetual storage and cryonics upkeep. This is how CI has operated since 1976. Some people prematurely dismiss cryonics because the technology to revive someone who has been cryogenically frozen does not exist yet. But they miss the point. Cryonics is really an ambulance ride now to a future hospital where that technology may someday exist. What does science say? There are now peer-reviewed scientific papers supporting cryonics, as well as many PhDs who have gone on record to support cryonics. Recent advances in stem cells, nanotechnology, and genetic engineering are proving that what was once considered impossible is becoming routine. Some have suggested that someday even aging itself may be halted or reversed. People once considered dead only 50 years ago today are revived with CPR and cardiac defibrillation. Cardiopulmonary resuscitation and organ transplant technology were once shunned by primitive thinkers, but today they are hailed as life-saving advances. If history has taught us anything, no one knows the future, and it is foolish to say what future technology will be impossible. Considering the alternative, which is certain death, cryonics is a rational scientific wager with little to lose and virtually everything to gain. Check out cryonics.org to learn more.
So this is a good time for me to remind you that we don't endorse any particular company or products. We do endorse the idea of cryonics, but will not say Cryonics Institute or Alcor or Osiris or Oregon Cryonics. We won't pick a particular company, but we will endorse the idea of cryonics and certainly anything that will help us to live healthy, long lives. You probably have some questions on this, so I'm happy to help you to get answers to those. Look forward to meeting with you downstairs and have some social time on this. Thank you for coming. Good night.